senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, before I begin, I would like to ask unanimous consent to put in the congressional record an open letter to the Russian leadership from the Russian Congress of Intellectuals, who state, and I quote, this is the Russian Congress of Intellectuals, "Our position is simple. Russia does not need a war with Ukraine and the West. Such a war is devoid of legitimacy and has no moral basis," end of quote. This is a very brave statement made by Russian intellectuals.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as I speak today, Europe, for the first time in almost 80 years, is faced with the threat of a major invasion. A large nation threatens a smaller, less powerful neighbor, surrounding it on three sides with well over 100,000 troops, as well as tanks and artillery. My colleagues, as we have painfully learned, wars have unintended consequences. They rarely turn out the way the planners and experts tell us they will. Just ask the officials who provided rosy scenarios for the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, only to be proven horribly wrong. Just ask the mothers of the soldiers who were killed or wounded in action during those wars. Just ask the families of the millions of civilians who became collateral damage in those wars. The war in Vietnam cost us 59,000 American deaths and many others who came home wounded in body and spirit. The casualties in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are almost incalculable, but they are in the millions. In Afghanistan, what began as a response to the horrific attack against us on 9/11/2001 eventually became a 20-year war, costing us $2 trillion and over 3,500 Americans who were killed, not to mention tens of thousands of Afghan civilians. George W. Bush claimed in 2003 that the United States had, quote, put the Taliban out of business forever, end of quote. Well, not quite the case. The Taliban is in power today. The war in Iraq, which was sold to the American people by stroking fear of a mushroom cloud from Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction, led to the deaths of some 4,500 U.S. troops and the wounding, physical and emotional, of tens of thousands of others. It led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, the displacement of over 5 million people, and regional destabilization whose consequences the world continues to grapple with today. In other words, despite all of the rosy scenarios we heard for those foreign policy and military interventions, it turned out that the experts were wrong, and millions of innocent people paid the price. That is why we must do everything possible to find a diplomatic resolution to prevent what would be an enormously destructive war in Ukraine. No one knows exactly what the human costs of such a war would be. There are estimates, however, that come from our own military and intelligence community that there could be over 50,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine, not to mention millions of refugees flooding neighboring countries as they flee what could be the worst European conflict since World War II. In addition, of course, there would be many thousands of deaths within the Ukrainian and Russian militaries. There is also the possibility that this regional war could escalate to other parts of Europe, a continent with many nuclear weapons. And what might happen then is beyond imagination. But that's not all. The sanctions against Russia that would be imposed as a consequence of its actions, and Russians' threatened response to those sanctions could result in massive economic upheaval with impacts on energy and gas and oil prices in our country, banking, food supplies, and the day-to-day needs of ordinary people throughout the entire world. It is likely that Russians will not be the only people suffering from sanctions. They would be felt throughout Europe, they would be felt right here in the United States, and likely around the world. And by the way, and we haven't discussed this terribly much, at a time when the scientific community tells us that climate change is an existential threat to the planet, any hope of international cooperation to address global climate change and to address future pandemics would likely suffer a major setback. Mr. President, it should be absolutely clear about who is most responsible for the looming crisis, and that is Russian President Vladimir Putin. Having already seized parts of Ukraine in 2014, Putin now threatens to take over the entire country and destroy Ukrainian democracy. There should be no disagreement that that behavior is totally unacceptable. In my view, we must unequivocally support the sovereignty of Ukraine and make clear that the international community will impose severe consequences on Putin and his fellow oligarchs if he does not change course. With that said, Mr. President, I am extremely concerned when I hear the familiar drumbeats in Washington, the bellicose rhetoric that gets amplified before every war, demanding that we must show strength, demanding that we must get tough, demanding that we must not engage in appeasement. A simplistic refusal to recognize the complex roots of the tensions in the region undermines the ability of negotiators to reach a peaceful resolution. Now, I know it is not very popular or politically correct, I guess, in Washington to consider the perspectives of our adversaries. But I think it's important that we do so if we are going to formulate good policy. I think it is helpful to consider this. One of the precipitating factors of this crisis, one, not the only one, at least from Russia's perspective, is the prospect of an enhanced security relationship between Ukraine and the United States and Western Europe, including what Russia sees as the threat of Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO, a military alliance originally created in 1949 to confront the Soviet Union. It is good to know some history. When Ukraine became independent after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russian leaders made clear their concerns about the prospect of former Soviet states becoming part of NATO and positioning hostile military forces along Russia's border. U.S. officials recognized these concerns as legitimate at the time. One of those officials was William Perry, who served as Defense Secretary under President Bill Clinton. In a 2017 interview, Perry said, and I quote, this is Defense Secretary under Bill Clinton, quote, "In the last few years, most of the blame can be pointed at the actions that Putin has taken. But in the early years, I have to say that the United States deserves much of the blame." Further quote, "Our first action that really set us off in a bad direction was when NATO started to expand, bringing in Eastern European nations, some of them bordering Russia." That is former Secretary of State William Perry. Another U.S. official who acknowledged these concerns is former U.S. diplomat Bill Burns, who is now head of the CIA in the Biden administration. In his memoir, Burns quotes a memo he wrote while serving as counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 1995, and I quote, "Hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here," end quote. Over 10 years later, in 2008, Burns wrote in a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and I quote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests," end of quote. So again, these concerns were not just invented yesterday by Putin out of thin air. Clearly, invasion by Russia is not an answer. Neither is intransigence by NATO. It is important to recognize, for example, that Finland, one of the most developed and democratic countries in the world, borders Russia and has chosen not to be a member of NATO. Sweden and Austria are other examples of prosperous and democratic countries that have made the same choice. Mr. President, Vladimir Putin may be a liar and a demagogue, but it is hypocritical for the United States to insist that we, as a nation, do not accept the principle of spheres of influence. For the last 200 years, our country has operated under the Monroe Doctrine, embracing the principle that as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has the right, according to the United States, to intervene against any country that might threaten our alleged interests. That's United States policy. And under this doctrine, the United States has undermined and overthrown at least a dozen countries throughout Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. As many might recall, in 1962, we came to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Now, why was that? Why did we almost come to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union? Well, we did that in response to the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba 90 miles from our shore. And the Kennedy administration saw that as an unacceptable threat to national security. We said it is unacceptable for a hostile country to have a significant military presence 90 miles away from our shore. And let us be clear, the Monroe Doctrine is not ancient history. As recently as 2018, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, called the Monroe Doctrine, quote, as relevant today as it was the day it was written, end quote. In 2019, former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton declared, quote, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well, end quote. To put it simply, even if Russia was not ruled by a corrupt, oligarchic, authoritarian leader like Vladimir Putin, Russia, like the United States, would still have an interest in the security policies of its neighbors. And I want people to think about this. Does anyone really believe that the United States would not have something to say if, for example, Mexico or Cuba or any country in Central or Latin America were to form a military alliance with the U.S. adversary? Do you think that members of Congress would stand up and say, well, you know, Mexico is an independent country. They have the right to do anything they want? I doubt that very much. Mr. President, countries should be free to make their own foreign policy choices. But making those choices wisely requires a serious consideration of the costs and benefits. The fact is that the U.S. and Ukraine entering into a deeper security relationship is likely to have some very serious costs for both countries. Mr. President, I believe that we must vigorously support the ongoing diplomatic efforts of the Biden administration to de-escalate this crisis. I believe we must reaffirm Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, and we must make clear to Putin and his gang of oligarchs that they will face major consequences should he continue down the current path. My colleagues, we must never forget the horrors that a war in the region would cause, and must do everything possible to achieve a realistic and mutually agreeable resolution, one that is acceptable to Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and our European allies, and that prevents what could be the worst European war since World War II. That approach is not weakness. It is not appeasement. Bringing people together to resolve conflicts without war is strength, and it is the right thing to do. Thank you, Mr. President. Yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Majority Whip.
Mr. President, I have 6 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. Mr. President, I listened carefully to the remarks of my friend and colleague, Senator Sanders of Vermont. I read his published article in the Guardian newspaper yesterday, and it paralleled many of the things which he said on the floor today. We have a very positive starting point between us. I think my record on voting to go to war may be identical to yours, if not very close. Neither of us want war. That is the last resort, and it is frightfully predictable that there will be innocent people killed even in the best of times, in the best of military force. Secondly, I couldn't agree with you more that we should be promoting all that we can in terms of diplomacy at this moment. The other night I had the opportunity to be in a meeting with some senators with the new Chancellor of Germany, Chancellor Scholz. He was on his way soon to Moscow. President Macron of France has been there. Others are going. I encourage that communication, that dialogue as much as possible. I think it is hopeful that these efforts can lead to a peaceful resolution in the controversy that we are now facing in Ukraine. Third point, which I certainly agree with, it is certainly in the interest of the United States for our values to make it clear that we want to protect and defend, at least not in a military fashion, let me say in a general fashion, the notion of sovereignty when it comes to Ukraine. It is up to the Ukrainian people to chart their course and make their future. Where I think we disagree, Senator, is on this whole question of sphere of influence. I'm afraid that suggestion is the green light for Vladimir Putin. If you will concede that he is somehow entitled, because of the size of his country, to reclaim Soviet republics or to move into other theaters, I'm sorry, but I have to part company with you at that point. I was fortunate enough 30 years ago or so to be on the ground in the Baltics when I saw a dramatic demonstration of courage rarely seen in the world. This tiny nation of 3 million people broke away from the Soviet Union and scheduled a free election. I was there the time the election took place, and we knew that it was an invitation for Mikhail Gorbachev to retaliate, and he did. He moved in the Soviet tanks and started killing innocent people. Before it was all over, more than a dozen innocent Lithuanians, several in Latvia, gave their lives because they wanted to be free again. And who would question why they would want that? I happen to have visited that area. My mother was born in Lithuania. I must put that on the record. But I happened to visit that area in 1978, and I saw what life was like in the Baltic states under Soviet rule. It was sad. It was enraging. It was disgusting. What they had done in the Soviet Union is to forcibly take those countries and others, some through the Warsaw Pact, some through the direct accession to the Soviet Union, and control every aspect of their lives with communism. I went to the University of Vilnius, which I believe dates back to the 16th century. They took me to their Catholic chapel, which under Soviet times had been converted into what they called a museum and tribute of atheism. On display in the middle of this former church setting, chapel setting, were showcases of boomerangs from Australia in this holy space, which they were trying to eradicate religion by demonstrating a new material approach to the entity. I only say this because when the time came and they finally, through their courage, broke from the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia came to me, knowing that I had an interest in the region, as did the Polish people, and said, we don't want to be under the thumb of Russia ever again. We want our freedom. We want to decide our future. The only way that we can achieve that is if we can ally with the United States. Can we be considered for NATO membership? And eventually, through a lot of hard work and determination, that's what occurred. Poland and the Baltic states, along with others, joined in the NATO alliance. It is worth noting here that the NATO alliance is a defensive alliance. The Suwalki Gap, which links Russia as it now exists with Kaliningrad, one of the former Soviet republics, is a gap, a land bridge, and on either side is Poland and Lithuania. It is still contested territory by the Russians, and they're concerned about it. When the Russians put tens of thousands of troops in military exercises on the Baltic border in Belarus, it's understandable they're concerned. They are small countries and could be easily pushed over. The only thing that saves them, I believe, is their NATO alliance. Should Ukraine be part of the NATO alliance? Well, there are two decisions that must be made, and the first and most important one is by the Ukrainian people. They have to decide if they believe that is in their best interest in their future. We cannot decide it for them, nor should we try to. And secondly, the NATO alliance has to decide. Under Article 5, are we willing to risk the lives of the NATO allies if some terrible event should occur in Ukraine? That is what the sovereign nations of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and so many other countries did when they decided to ask for membership in NATO. I don't understand this theory of yours that somehow Vladimir Putin is entitled to a sphere of influence or control. That to me is unacceptable and inconsistent with the notion of Ukrainian sovereignty. If they are to decide their future, how can we say that Vladimir Putin has any voice in that process? There is a way that he can find a more peaceful situation in the world, and it's if he'll stop being a thug and stop sending his troops on the borders of the country and stop cutting off gas supplies to countries that he doesn't like. I mean, his strong-arm tactics deserve a response from the United States, and I'm afraid simply sending a harsh letter is not enough anymore. So we've made it clear that he'll pay a price if he invades. The NATO alliance has. That price will be a string of sanctions, which are included, some of them, in the legislation that Senator Menendez is working on and which I've co-sponsored. But that is the only way to make it clear to him that such a price will be paid. What he has done is very obvious to me. He has united the NATO alliance in a way we didn't expect. And there were some divisions within the alliance, some serious and some not serious. But he has brought us together, and we should be together, standing in defense of the territory of the NATO allies and making it clear that if Vladimir Putin is going to try to extend his reach into Ukraine or any other area, he will at least meet with political resistance. I think at a minimum that's where it should be. I hope it doesn't go any further. I share your feeling on that. I don't want a military situation to escalate and to threaten American lives or involve us at that level at all. But unless we are firm with him now and don't concede that he has any sphere of influence in Ukraine, I'm afraid he'll take advantage of the situation. Open question if you have one, or I'd like to have a dialogue possible on this.
I appreciate.
Through the chair, of course.
I appreciate the thoughts of my friend from Illinois. And much of what he said, I obviously agree with. My father came from Poland, as a matter of fact. I think maybe the difference of opinion that we have has something to do with what we don't talk about very often, openly, but I think everybody knows exists. I mentioned, and I think you will not disagree with me, that over the last many, many decades, the United States has overthrown governments throughout Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. There is no denying that we almost went to a nuclear war in 1962 under the Kennedy administration, who felt, I think probably correctly, that Soviet missiles in Cuba, 90 miles away from us, were a threat to this country and not to be tolerated. So I would only ask my friend from Illinois to put himself into the mindset of Russians. And that is, nobody here, not me certainly, is ever talking about reclaiming other countries. I mean, you mentioned that, certainly not anything that I support. But if the United States has a right to overthrow countries throughout Latin America to protect our so-called interests, if there would be an uproar in this chamber, perhaps from you and me as well, if Mexico, an independent nation, decided to form a military alliance with China or Russia, people would say, you can't do that. Should we not put ourselves a little bit in Russia's position and understanding that if we consider Latin America and Central America and the Caribbean within our sphere of influence, the right to intervene, that Russia itself might have some legitimate concerns about military forces 5 miles from their border? That's the question I would pose.
And it's a legitimate historic question, but if you're saying that in the name of the Monroe Doctrine, to protect ourselves in this hemisphere, we have done things which we're not proud of today, interfering with the sovereignty of nations. The term banana republic emerged from that Monroe Doctrine, and what happened in many of these countries. They became vassals of the United States economy. And I don't say that with any pride. We wouldn't want to welcome that to happen in Europe, would we, in the name of Putin exercising some sphere of influence and invading the sovereignty of other nations?
But my point is, no, we would not. But my point is the Monroe Doctrine remains in existence today. It's not just history. You and I can agree that maybe the United States should not have overthrown governments over the years. The Monroe Doctrine exists today. 2 years ago, Secretary of State said it is in existence. I don't know how many people in this chamber would tell you that it does not exist today. I use that example to my friend from Illinois. If Mexico were to enter into an alliance with China, would my friend say, well, Mexico is an independent country. They have the right to do anything they want?
I think that hypothetical is just that. Of
sorry?
course, it's only a hypothetical, but look at the reality. It wasn't that long ago when Ecuador elected a new president. At the inauguration of that president were representatives of Russia, Cuba, and Iran. Now, you wouldn't put any of those countries today on a list of close American allies. And yet, did we invade Ecuador? Never considered it. Never considered it. We live in a different time in the 21st century. I understand the Monroe Doctrine in the days of gunboat diplomacy and the days of moving a handful of troops in to take control back on the Dominican Republic. But to posit the notion that somehow there's going to be a military alliance on the border of the United States, therefore Putin is entitled to compromise the sovereignty of Ukraine, that doesn't follow, Senator.
No, it does. All that I'm saying is 2 years ago, the Secretary of State of the United States of America said the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. And yes, of course, it's hypothetical. I do not believe that Mexico is going to enter an alliance with China. But all I ask is to put what is going on in Russia into a context and to look at American policy and history as well. This is a complicated issue, and I think it's important for us to at least look at the concerns that Russia has. There is no disagreement that if Putin were to commit the horrible, horrible blunder of invading Ukraine, count me in as somebody who will go as far as we can to make sure there are real consequences against the oligarchs and that policy. But I do think if we're going to reach a settlement in a very complicated issue, it is important for us to understand a little bit about Russia's concerns.
I would only disagree in this respect. I believe Ukraine has been a victim of Russian aggression for a long period of time. The leader, Yanukovych, I believe his name was, who was deposed in Ukraine at the Maidan, when the Maidan demonstrations took place, was clearly a servant and vassal of Moscow. It was the Soviets, I call them Soviets, forgive me, the Russians, who invaded Crimea and reclaimed that territory for their own. It was the Russians who sent in little green men with no emblems on their uniforms to invade eastern Ukraine and continue to kill innocent Ukrainians for 8 years now. So it's clear to me that Ukraine has been a victim of Russian aggression for a long period of time. To suggest the notion that this is somehow within Putin's sphere of influence is to rationalize his conduct, to forgive his conduct, and I'm not about to do that. I don't think we should. You don't put 110,000 Russian troops on the border and prepare for a war unless you believe that you can pressure that country into acceding to your demands. Ukraine is not a military power. It won't last very long, sadly, if the Russians do invade. But, you know, at this moment, I think saying sphere of influence, the United States has made its own mistakes in the past in the name of sphere of influence, and therefore we should look the other way at what Putin is doing, is just an unacceptable conclusion and contradictory.
The Senator knows I am not for looking the other way, and that's not a fair statement. I am, as I've said many, many times, strongly supportive of major, major, major consequences if Putin invades Ukraine, and we've got to do everything we can to protect Ukrainian sovereignty. All right, I made my point, and that's about it.
And I thank you for it. And I just want to close by saying that there is I see senators waiting to speak. Close by saying that I hope very soon in the next couple of weeks to make a trip to Poland and to the Baltics. And I will tell you that the people of Polish descent and Ukrainian descent and Baltic descent in the state that I represent are watching these events by the day. They lived through the Soviet takeover of their countries. They understand what happened to their basic freedoms of speech and political expression and religious belief as a result of it. They don't want to return to those days. The United States has said we are committed to their democracy and their values, and I think we have demonstrated it and should continue to. I sincerely hope Putin does not take advantage of this situation and invade Ukraine. I'm not calling for a military response, but we should have the type of response that he will never forget if he does something that foolhardy. I yield the floor.